I'd like to introduce Dr. Karen Brien. She is a lecturer in Asian religions and ethics at the University of Roehampton in the UK. She has published several peer-reviewed articles in South Asian journals, and she was the co-editor of this volume, Routledge Handbook of Yoga and Meditation Studies, that came out in 2020. So it's a very big volume and very comprehensive. Dr. O'Brien has published, is about to publish a monograph with Bloomsbury Academic, and that is titled Rethinking Classical Yoga and Buddhism, Meditation, Metaphors and Materiality. She has been for quite some time the co-chair of the Indian and Chinese Religions Compared Unit of the American Academy of Religion, and she's also on the steering committee of the Yoga Studies Unit of the American Academy of Religion. Today's talk is titled Śāstras on Yoga and Yogācāra, and I very much look forward to that talk. Please.
Thank you, Gudrun, for that kind invitation. And thank you very much to the conference organizers for inviting me to talk today. In past years, my research has focused on the productive conversation between Buddhism and Brahmanism, as reflected in yoga and meditation treatises or Śāstras from the 2nd to 5th centuries. I've been addressing several Buddhist texts that were contemporaneous to the final redaction of the Pātañjala Yoga Shastra, so around the 4th century, with the purpose of reading sideways or intertextually into the cultural conversation, rather than focusing on longer chronologies. So when I submitted the title for this paper, it was very general. It was Śāstras on Yoga and Yogācāra, because I wasn't sure exactly which of those texts I wanted to focus on today. But as you can see, I have now added a subtitle, and I'll be looking at two texts. The first is the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra, where I'll be sharing some extracts from my monograph, which is due to be published in a couple of weeks. And the observations here will stay at quite a general level. We'll be thinking about the practice of Yogācāra, excuse me, in the early Common Era and how it might relate to yoga. And I've highlighted this theme of practice in the first section, partly in the second section as well, to hopefully address some of the interests of the majority attendees today who I believe are from communities of practice. And in the second section, I hope to introduce in a little more detail the Qizil Yoga manual, which we heard about from Philip this morning, or the so-called Yoga Lehrbuch. And I'll share some research highlights from an article that's getting closer to publication. And in this, I'm going to deal with more specific textual readings in order to think about the text method of visualization, yogic visualization. I'm interested in how reading these Buddhist texts and others informs and enriches my understanding of the Pātañjala Yoga Shastra, which has so far been at the heart of my research, even though I'm not going to be referring to it very much today. But the overall argument of the paper is that by drawing on contemporary research in Buddhist studies, we can map out a richer and more granular picture of the discipline of yoga in the early Common Era that extends beyond the Pātañjala Yoga Shastra. So not superseding it in any way, but simply broadening the scope of our purview. So let's start with the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra. The Buddhist Yogācārabhūmiśāstra, to introduce it a little, is a voluminous text attributed to Asaṅga. Although various layers can be dated back to the 2nd century approximately, it has its final redaction in the late 4th century of the Common Era and is a self-labeled Śāstra or treatise about Yogācāra. And I'll suggest that we translate this as discipline of yoga or perhaps adept of yoga, but we'll come back to this point. The Yogācārabhūmiśāstra consists of two parts, the basic section and the supplementary section. So the basic section, which you can see outlined here, contains 14 so-called books, or quite large sections, that describe 17 stages or foundations, i.e. bhumis, of Yogācāra. And each book is in turn divided into sections titled Topic of Yoga or Yogasthana. The supplementary section, which is not really a commentary, it contains 4 parts that do sometimes comment on the books, but also describe many other and address many other topics. This supplementary section also includes an independent work, an important work in Mahayana Buddhism called the Nimochina Sutra. Now, one of the reasons why to date this work has been somewhat relatively understudied in yoga studies is because the basic section is only partially extant in Sanskrit, and the majority of the supplementary section is extant only in Chinese and Tibetan. So our access to this text is a matter of language expertise beyond Sanskrit. And actually, when we look at the historical timeline for the discovery of manuscript sections of this Śāstra, the creation of critical editions of the various books and their translation into other languages, we see that these events happen much later than they did for the Pātañjala Yoga Śāstra. And I'll comment on that again at the end of this section. So what does Yogācāra mean? Well, in general, we can say that Yogācāra primarily denoted systems of meditation. This is evident in the general Yogācāra literature of the period, and specifically in the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra. In his translation of one of these other texts, the Saddharma Smriti Upasthana Sutra, abbreviated here to the Sadzu, and this is a Sarvastivada meditation sutra from around the 2nd century, perhaps to the 4th. Stewart renders Yogācāra in this text as not only meditation practitioner, but more specifically, master of yoga. Yogācāra, in Stewart's words, denoted a master practitioner whose spiritual presence can be interpreted as an instantiation of the power of the Buddha in the world. In the Sadzu, Yogācāra is a meditative practice of discernment or prajna, specifically in relation to the laws of karma, with the practitioner gaining a level of omniscience comparable to the Buddha's. Furthermore, in this text, the Saddharma Smriti Upasthana Sutra, the Yogācāras are depicted as a unique group with elevated status. Not only does the Buddha state that he does not see anyone other than his Yogācāra disciples, but we also have the claim that the Buddha himself was originally a part of this community. In broad terms, what else might have distinguished Yogācāra within general Buddhist practice of the period? Well, Busha proposes that there was a distinctive visionary quality to the practices called Yogācāra that developed in northwest India. So that would be Greater Kashmir, Gandhara, Gilgit. So that's modern day India, but also Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this will be relevant when we think about the Qizil Yoga manual later on, both in terms of Kashmir and the northwestern region, but also in terms of practices of visualization. However, the nuanced meaning of the term Yogācāra is still under debate. In contrast to the later doxographical use of Yogācāra to refer to a distinct philosophical school of Buddhism, the early uses of this term are much more shadowy and are connected with ideas of practice rather than philosophy. The key questions in the debate are whether the term is generic, whether it can be associated with any specific concepts of yoga, and whether it refers to practice or practitioner. I think it refers to both practice and practitioner. While Silk argued that Yogācāra was a generic word for spiritual practice, there is a growing consensus that Yogācāra had a more specific meaning. It is, of course, possible to acknowledge that some connotations of Yogācāra were not fixed without resorting to the position that the term meant nothing in particular. For Davidson, the earliest meaning of Yogācāra was quite simply yogin. Krag follows this line of reasoning. Depending on context, Yogācāra means yoga practitioner and secondarily means yoga practice. Krag even goes so far as to define the 4th century usage of the term in the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra as school of yoga practitioners. For Delanu, yoga in the compound Yogācāra carries not just the generic meaning of application or purpose, but reflects that the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra was closely connected to a specific yogic milieu, which denoted Buddhist groups that practice specialist spiritual cultivation. Going back to the Saddharma Smriti Upasthana Sutra, the narrative framing of the text means that the sutra can be read as a text detailing the making of a Yogācāra, in Stuart's words. In the sadhu, Yogācāra communities refer to themselves as having a practice of yoga, and a Yogācāra monk is described as yogam astitaha, established in the practice of yoga. Stuart traces the evolution of the common term Yogācāra as a Sanskritized form of the canonical Middle Indic term Yogācārya. In the Pali canon, the term Yogācārya denoted animal trainer or horse charioteer, a familiar image that we often encounter in the Brahmanic literature in relation to yoga, including the Upanishads. Rejecting Silk's assessment of Yogācāra as a generic term, Stuart posits that the sadhu demonstrates the use of the term Yogācāra in a precise way to refer to a specific type of meditation practitioner with a specific set of practices and a mastery of karma. Given that the ideal subject of the sadhu is a Yogācāra, the identification of this subject as a yogin reinforces the connection between the two terms, yogin and Yogācāra. So we can see here a verse from the Saddharma Smriti Upasthana Sutra. He who, not taken up with unwholesome action, constantly delights in wholesome action, is one who delights in purity, which is like the cool rays of the moon. Such a person is a practitioner. And I've just added yogi here in blue because Stuart translates yogi as practitioner. I propose a primary definition of Yogācāra as one who practices a discipline of yoga or yoga adept, with a general meaning of practice or discipline of yoga. So Yogācāra in the Buddhist texts of the early Common Era then appears to have been a general appellation for Buddhist practitioners of yoga, in the way that yogin was a common label for those practicing in Brahmanic circles. Although the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra has been historically categorized as a Mahayana text, in fact, as Delanu and others have pointed out, the majority of the content is in fact Śravakayana or mainstream Buddhism, with nascent strands of Mahayana. Centuries before Yogācāra was identified as a distinct school of philosophy, in the 5th to 6th centuries, there were already early Yogācāra communities in the Sarvastivada Abhidharma stream of Śravakayana Buddhism. Indeed, the very title of the earliest book of the Yogācāra Bhumi, the Śravaka Bhumi, reflects its Śravakayana affiliation. It is evident then that early Yogācāra, as a strand of Buddhist meditative practice, emerged within the Sarvastivada Abhidharma tradition. Yamabi also supports this argument, noting that the close connections between the Yogācāra Bhumi of Sangaraksha, probably the very earliest kernel of the Yogācāra Bhumi, Anshigao's Dao Di Jing, which is a partial translation of that, and then Asaṅga's later treatise, the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra, the connections between these texts suggest that Yogācāra meditators were forming their own somewhat distinct circle within the Sarvastivada community. Now, later on, the Sarvastivada Yogācāras became influenced by the Bodhisattva path of the Sandhi Nimochina Sutra, a clear Mahayana text that's embedded in the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra. And although Yogācāra communities emerged within Sarvastivada, an enhanced focus on yoga discipline became a key marker by which Mahayana sought to distinguish itself from Śravakayana Buddhism. So just to sum up some points in this opening section, it's an overstatement to characterize the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra as a Mahayana text. Early Yogācāra practice was liminal, existing at the threshold of mainstream and Mahayana. The 4th century Yogācārabhūmiśāstra contains not just one model of Yogācāra, but rather at least two, one which was indebted to Sarvastivada Abhidharma, scholasticism and meditation, and one intent on forging an innovated and applied concept of yoga discipline or Yogācāra. Now, this characterization of Yogācāra as partly Sarvāstivadan in origin is relevant, I would argue, to any consideration of the Pātañjala Yoga Śāstra, because as Mas, Vujastik, many others, and I have argued elsewhere, there are overlaps and interactions between the Pātañjala Yoga Śāstra and a key Sarvastivada text, the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya by Vasubandhu. And all of this points to a strong role for the Sarvastivada school of mainstream Buddhism in the early formation of yoga. To put it another way, we might argue that at least some of the roots of Patanjali Yoga are somehow planted in the Sarvastivada tradition. So to say something about the regional affiliation of Yogācāra, it was affiliated with the northwest region of India, and the legendary Yogācāra masters are described as hailing from Kashmir. Given the association of early Yogācāra with Sarvastivada thought, this is no surprise, because the Kashmir Valley also formed the central region for the Sarvastivada Vaibhashika tradition that produced Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. And indeed, the 2nd century text, the Abhidharma Mahavibhasha Śāstra, a canonical text, refers to Sarvastivada meditation practitioners as Yogācāras or Yogācāryas on some 140 occasions. But of course, we must be prepared to think beyond any exclusive association with the Northwest, because the Abhidharma Mahavibhasha Śāstra also mentions northern Yogācāras, southern Yogācāras, and Yogācāras everywhere. Delanue's assessment is that these regional groups were not doctrinally different, but rather the difference between these groups refers to a gloss of a linguistic nature. I do have some questions about this as to whether perhaps the northern, southern, and Yogācāras everywhere does actually refer to sectarian communities. Generally, however, we can assert that Kashmiri Sarvastivada Yogācāras played a major role in the formation of the earliest 2 books of the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra. And those 2 books are the Shravaka Bhumi and the Bodhisattva Bhumi. So now let's get to the interesting question, what was early Yogācāra practice in the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra? Well, this text refers to the existence of exclusive communities of Yogācāras who are not just ordinary meditation practitioners, but rather an advanced or elite class of, as Krag calls them, rigorous meditators. At the outset of the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra, we are provided with definitions of both Yogācāra and Yogācārabhūmi, and this is a quite unsatisfactory rendering, actually, of that definition, because it's from Demiville's French translation from the Chinese, so I think quite imperfect. But we do have an instance here in which we can see that Yogācāra is primarily referring not to a practitioner, but rather foregrounding the idea of practice itself and the ground of practice. Specifically, the Yogācārabhūmi of Sangha, that early kernel, perhaps dating from the 2nd century, I think Delanue puts it maybe even earlier. This text supports those 2 definitions of Yogācāra and Yogācārabhūmi with 2 prescriptions of what one should both refrain from, anger and lust, etc., and what one should cultivate. In practice, there are 2 steps of meditation: tranquility, which is shamatha, a contemplation of impurity, and controlled breathing techniques, and insight is the contemplation of emptiness. In terms of lifestyle, many Yogācāras were ordained. Yogācāra often appears in the phrase Yogācāra bhikshu, which Krag translates as yoga practitioner monk. This not only suggests that many such meditation adepts were ordained, but also that the intended audience of the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra may have been monks and nuns. Krag asserts that the monastic component of the Yogācāra's identity may in fact be a central feature in the Yogācārabhūmi, irrespective of whether Yogācāras in the earlier periods were so inclined. Let's just check my slides. Yeah. The section on general meditative objects in the Śravaka ends by explaining how a monk who is a yoga practitioner should practice the next set of foci. He is referred to using the common epithet Bhikshur Yogi Yogācāra, a label that combines 3 states of monk, yogin, and practitioner of yoga. Bhusha points out that Bhikshur Yogi Yogācāra is a standing phrase in works such as the Revata Sutra, which is quoted in the Śravaka. All 3 nouns here appear in the nominative case and are apposite, indicating that Bhikshu, Yogin, and Yogācāra were 3 distinct categories. Silk suggests that in this phrase, Yogin is a synonym for Yogācāra Bhikshu, but we could also suggest that Bhikshur Yogi was a gloss for Yogācāra. Thus, a Yogācāra was conventionally a monk yogin. So simply a yogin who is a monk, and this is of course different to the Brahmanic tradition in which there are no monks as such at this time. There are many competing theories as to how Mahayana ideology arose within Buddhism. One controversial argument is that Mahayana emerged as an orthodox response amongst ascetic forest monks to restore what they saw as a purer form of Buddhism. This locates the roots of Mahayana yoga in forest-dwelling monastic asceticism. But whatever the outcome of these larger debates and controversies regarding early Mahayana, the meditation manuals depict the Yogachara as a forest dweller, which refers here to any isolated place, not necessarily a forest as such. This feature of isolation is a basic condition of asceticism. The Yogācārabhūmi of Sangha describes the Yogachara as engaging in solitary meditation in his hermitage under a tree, and in another chapter, in his hermitage or in an isolated place. Indeed, this is one of the ways in which consulting a text as unwieldy as the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra becomes useful when trying to understand the practices of yoga and Yogācāra. A text as vast as the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra contains many marginal and ancillary descriptions of social and material conditions of yoga discipline. What were the conditions of day-to-day practice like? The Śravaka gives us some answers to this question in its account of the obstacles that the Yogachara faced. Difficulty in obtaining alms food, bedding, and medicine, trouble in finding a suitable outdoor location for meditation, exposure to the elements at night and fear of spirits at night, the wearing of clothes made of rough felt or found on the trash heap, and so on. So we can glean some details about the historical subjects of the text, about their actual embodied and perhaps material practices. On this point, the Bhavanamaya Bhumi is also useful. It explains how adverse conditions arise in different types of practitioners. So we're told that there are householders, renunciants or ordained persons, and those who have entered into solitude to practice yoga. This very statement perhaps implies that yoga was not practiced by a householder, a renunciate, or an ordained person, or that yoga discipline was reserved for a different or special class of practitioner, one who operated in deep solitude. The Bhavanamaya Bhumi describes how the Yogachara enters deep seclusion with tranquility practices and attains mastery through devotion to ascetic austerity. These higher stages of isolated ascetic austerity indicate that the most advanced levels of Yogācāra were uniquely demanding and not conducive to the social life of the householder or even a monk in a monastery. The Śravaka extols the Arhat Revata, who was declared by the Buddha to be foremost among the forest dwellers and who delighted in solitude, sitting cross-legged. In the Śravaka we're told that the conditions for yoga discipline are a state of retreat, isolation in a desolate place, sitting all day in seated posture, cultivation of one-pointedness of mind, and attaining samadhi, which is a stream of mind characterized by bliss, whose focus is an object of constant mindfulness. Again, it is clear that this level of isolated meditation practice was not necessarily compatible with social living and relies on intensely continuous cultivation and an ascetic lifestyle in a remote setting. In assessing the identity of the subject and audience of the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra, we must not overlook the frame of the text itself, who produced the voluminous Yogācārabhūmiśāstra. If we put to one side for the moment the notion of a single author, Asaṅga, Hakamaya argues that the Yogācārabhūmi must have been compiled by monks who were scholars as well as meditators. And Stewart agrees that the Yogacharas were a textual community, so they were involved in not only meditation, but also the production and transmission of texts. Such learned scribes were perhaps one and the same as the forest meditators. So in short, we should not assume that Yogacharas were, quote unquote, only practicing meditation, but that they were also scholars, philosophers, as well as practitioners. The distinct or perhaps elite status of Yogacharas as advanced practitioners may also point to initiation and secrecy. Arguing that the Bodhisattva Bhumi distinctly reworks the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna's two truths for a new audience, Aramaki suggests that a Bodhisattva Yogācāra is an expert in the secrets of mind, conception, and consciousness. Being an expert in supreme truth allows the Yogācāra to teach on the mundane or conventional truth of citta, manas, and vijnana. What qualifies the Yogācāra to access supreme truth is initiation, which then enables them to teach to uninitiated bodhisattvas. Yogacharas were also granted special status due to their supernatural powers. A passage from the Mahavastu warns bodhisattvas of being distracted on the path by Yogacharas who constantly dwell in meditation. Stewart suggests this association with supernatural powers was also a defining feature of early Yogacharas and set them apart. So we can see here that this is evidenced by a passage from Buddhasena's Yogācārabhūmi. From one lofty state to another, he gradually controls the mind. Flying and transforming as he likes, unhindered, he is called a Yogācāra due to the strength of his subtle and wondrous powers. Therefore, the elite ranking of Yogacharas may have reflected not only their mastery of techniques, their privileged association with the Buddha, and their learned status, but also the fact that some were initiated and were perceived to have supernatural capacities. So to sum up these points on who was a Yogācāra and what was Yogācāra practice, we can say that relatively little is known about the earliest Yogacharas who identified as belonging to Sarvastivada Abhidharma communities. But as Yogācāra starts to become a defining feature of Mahayana, Yogacharas were conventionally monks, but they were not everyday monks. They appear to have been a distinct group of advanced meditation practitioners who spent extended periods in austere conditions of isolated retreat. They focused on cultivating wisdom or prajna, and their meditative practices sometimes had a visionary quality. These Yogacharas were also connected to learned and philosophical communities who recorded and systematized these practices of advanced meditation in texts, primarily reflecting Sarvastivada thought. They may have undergone special initiation and were perceived to hold secret teachings and to possess extraordinary powers. Finally, they appear to have been concentrated in the northwest regions, particularly Kashmir. Okay, so the main objective of this part of the talk has been to draw greater interest towards the Yogācārabhūmi as a valuable target for research for those who are interested in yoga studies, but who are perhaps currently primarily oriented towards Hindu texts. I think there is a long line of historical factors that have led to this Buddhist text being somewhat overlooked in the colonial creation of classical yoga. And I discuss this whole issue much more in the book. But to perhaps here add a couple of brief observations as to why interest in the Yogācārabhūmi has lagged behind somewhat. As I mentioned when I opened this section, there was a significant time lapse in the reception histories of Brahmanical yoga and Buddhist Yogācāra in Europe. While knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita's account of yoga was assimilated into European discourse from even the late 18th century, and part translations of the Yoga Sutra were being published from the mid-19th century, In contrast, we see that even though the European scholar Burnouf had been translating Pali texts since the 1820s, there was, by the mid-19th century, in comparison, only a very vague knowledge of the contents and significance of Asaṅga's Yogācārabhūmiśāstra among European scholars. And one example of such limited understanding was the analysis by Indologist Köppen, who included a discussion of Asaṅga's work in his 1859 volume, Die Religion des Buddha. And Köppen's skewed assessment was that Asaṅga's Śāstra was the first source to harmonize the teachings of Shaiva Tantra with Mahayana philosophy and its theory of meditation. During the second half of the 19th century, European scholarship on Yogācāra did not advance significantly. As Wang Chuk describes, British Indologists such as Hodgson and the Wright brothers took Sanskrit manuscripts from Nepal throughout the 19th century, but it was not until 1883 that they were catalogued in Cambridge University. Among these manuscripts was a palm leaf copy of the Bodhisattva Bhumi, one of the earliest and largest portions of the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra. And it was a Japanese scholar, Wogihara, who first took interest in this manuscript, eventually publishing the first critical edition of the Bodhisattva Bhumi in the 1930s. Meanwhile, another Bodhisattva Bhumi manuscript, this time on paper, was discovered by Japanese scholar Sakaki in 1914, and that was taken to the Kyoto University Library. And a further palm leaf manuscript of this text, the Bodhisattva, this time was bundled with the Shravaka Bhumi. It was found and photographed in a Tibetan monastery in 1938 by the Indian scholar Sankrityayana. And subsequently, his photographs were photographed again by the Italian scholar Tucci. But what we can see from this trajectory is that, to sum up, any awareness of the Sanskrit manuscripts of the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra occur well after awareness of the Yoga Sutra. Much of the early work on this text has been carried out by Japanese scholars and established Japan as a main center for scholarship on Yogācāra outside of India. And since Buddhism was a minority religion in India in the 19th and 20th centuries, the interest of Indian scholars was somewhat limited, so that although Sankrityayana deposited his negatives, his photograph negatives, in the Bihar Research Society in Patna, it was not until the 1960s that Nalinaksha Dutt published the first critical edition of the Bodhisattva Bhumi to be produced in India. So I think I will pause there on the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra, but I'm happy to come back to it in questions so that we can turn to the second text that I want to discuss today, also relatively understudied in yoga studies and Buddhist studies, but for quite different reasons. The Central Asian Yoga Manual, or the Yoga Lehrbuch from Qizil, is a fragmentary Buddhist meditation text from approximately 4th to 6th century of the Common Era. This manual describes meditative practices, sometimes called yoga, and refers to a practitioner as a Yogachara or a yogin. It also references a prior Yoga Shastra from which it says the teachings are distilled, and a lot has been omitted. It also bears the imprint of several South Asian Yogachara meditation manuals. From 1903 to 1906, there was a find of manuscript fragments in Qizil in the Kusha region and in Shorchuk in modern China by the third German expedition to Turfan. Qizil, as you can perhaps see here, is some 42 miles to the west of Kusha. You can see Kusha on this map, an oasis kingdom. And Qizil was an important hub, as was Kusha, on the northern Silk Road and a thriving center of Buddhism from the 3rd to 8th centuries. It was also the site of a Buddhist cave complex, the early construction phase of which is dated to the lifetime of Kumarajiva, so 344 to 423, and which these caves contain images of objects and figures in meditation. And I'll say more about the caves later on. One of the fragmentary Sanskrit texts found at Qizil and written in the Brahmi script was partially reconstructed and translated into German by the scholar Schlingloff in 1964. And since the title of the text was not apparent from the surviving fragments, Schlingloff named the text Yoga Lehrbuch, or Yoga Manual. His achievements are incredibly impressive because he had to piece together his edition from a vast array of manuscript fragments, and the fragility and dispersion of the surviving fragments in different libraries today partly accounts for the relative lack of scholarship on this text. This yoga manual reflects both Buddhist Savastivada and early Yogācāra meditation, and most likely represents the transmission of Buddhist practices from Kashmir and Gandhara to the Kusha region. A few related fragments of slightly different versions of this text have been found, and existence of multiple copies indicates that, at least in Kusha, the text had a circulation, and we could even speculate that it was an important text in this region. In fact, the Qizil Yoga Manual is part of a longer manuscript, numbering some 170 pages, that appears to have contained two separate works on yoga bundled together. The first text, around 114 pages in length, was, according to the colophon, called the Yoga Vidhi, and contained, as Schlingloff describes it, sutras and a commentary thereon, dedicated to the topic of Yogācāra, or the practice of yoga. The connections of the Qizil Yoga Manual to South Asian Yogachara texts have been noted. As Schlingloff observed, the primary orientation of the text is Savastivada Abhidharma, but it also converges with the Mahayana Bodhisattva ideal. In structure, the Qizil fragment is similar to the Dharmadrata Dhyana Sutra, aka Buddhasena's Yogācārabhūmiśāstra, aka the Dhammajuolo Chan Jing, thought to be based on Sangharakshita's very early prototype of the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra. And as Davidson has shown, the content of the Qizil fragment also maps to Asaṅga's Bodhisattva Bhumi. So the Qizil text then shares structure and content with both early Yogācāra and Savastivada meditation texts. The Qizil Manual foregrounds visual meditative exercises carried out by an adept, variously called a yogin or Yogācāra, and the emphasis on visualization recalls Busha's observation, which I mentioned earlier, that there was a distinctive visionary quality to the practices called Yogācāra that developed in Northwest India. The contents of the Qizil Manual are as follows, as you can see displayed here. I won't read through them all, apart from to say that we will focus on the third section on extracts from the Dhatu Prayoga, or the exercises on the elements. On the surface, each of the 11 sections represents a fairly standard list of Buddhist Savastivada meditation topics. Yet, as Yamabi has suggested, the Kusha people seem to have exercised a significant degree of originality in regard to some details of this text. And the claim for Central Asian innovation is largely made because the manual also describes vivid visualizations that, in comparison to some of the texts of the period, seem extraordinary, paralogical, or bizarre. So I'm going to focus now on some of those verses from the Dhatu Prayoga section, section 3 of the text, which describe some of these vivid visualization techniques. And you'll see here that I'm taking, at the moment, the text from Schlingloff's original critical edition, even though there is, as I mentioned, a new, or as I put on a slide, a new critical edition and translation soon to be published by a team working between Germany and China and funded by the Robert Ho Foundation. At the outset of the section on Dhatu Prayoga, we are told exactly so for one who has completed the preparations, beginning with moral conduct. The yogin focuses the mind between the nails of the big toes. Then the nail interstice appears as if it were the mouth of a makara, a water creature, into which the mind enters. And I think there is still a big question over exactly what the makara is, and it has some very different connotations in Hindu and Buddhist sources. Other visualizations include the elements appearing from underneath the meditator's fingernails and suffusing the entire world before disappearing into the mouths of the makaras, pearl necklaces emerging from the head of the meditator, visualizations of ghee and sesame oil filling up the body through a hole in the head. In a meditation on the 6 elements, a sword emerges from the navel of the meditator and arranges the 6 parts of the meditator's body separately on his skin. So this might refer to the 6 elements, including consciousness, being rearranged onto the skin of the body. And with both hands, the yogin examines the 6 elements one by one. Elsewhere, 107 snakes in the body destroy 107 joints and moisten the tendons, thus causing them to separate. As we can see here, so many snakes in so many joints, they burn the tendons. The meditator sees his own motionless body and all sentient beings as if falling down to the ground. And this theme of pulling apart internal features of the body is noteworthy. It has somewhat of a biomedical tone, and we see in other Buddhist texts, other Buddhist practices of visualization, that this meditative dissection is found in the Pali canon, in Chinese texts like the Sutra on the ocean-like samadhi of the visualization of the Buddha, or other sutras like the Secret Essential Methods for Curing Meditation Sickness, which advocate a very graphic visualization of the organ of the brain. These visualizations put the body at the center of the picture. The images emanate not only from the yogin's mind, but also from their body in intense visceral detail. As we can see here, streams of people pour forth from the hairs of the head, pulsating and disintegrating. After each emanation, the visualizations are rhythmically absorbed back into the body, often through the navel. So you can see in this working translation, the yogin sees his own form sunken up to the navel. Their location appears completely filled with trees at whose roots monks are seated, practicing the elemental exercises. And again, from the spaces between their toenails, elements pour forth, penetrate the whole world, and are dissolved in the self-same mouths of the makaras. Just so, the yogin sees the earth filled with persons made of the 6 elements. Finally, everything is brought back into the navel. Certain apertures of the body, such as the navel, function as gateways or interfaces between the internally generated visualizations and an externally imagined real world. And in this instance, an emanation from the body not only appears in the world, but changes the world. So reading here another passage, the meditator fills the whole world with the rays of blue and so forth of his own body. Then he goes out of the 4 seas. A stream of flowers that has come out of his navel goes out to the 4 directions and falls on the 4 seas. And the seas are then filled with these lotuses from the yogin's body. So these visualizations are not just one-way projections onto an external canvas of objective reality, but they are transactional processes that are also altering and changing the subject, the body of the yogin too. Moreover, it is not just simply the idea of a body, but the very materiality of the body itself, which is on display in meditative visualization. So the images, I think, are really offering an exploration of a very visceral material subjectivity. From another passage, we're told the meditator sees his own body filled with winds. He sees the winds entering through all the body openings, sees himself sunk in the lake of oil, and that oil has entered him through all of the body openings. Indeed, many of the images in the Dhatu Prayoga are disturbing or exciting, such as the figure of a man arising and holding a knife, or the sequence of a woman emerging from a black and heated boil in the middle of the eyebrows. Again, I think that such graphically visceral images are highlighting an emphasis on embodiment. Indeed, the body of the meditator is most acutely referred to in the text using the term ashraya. In each elemental visualization, the form of the yogin or the ashraya, which Schlinglhoff translates variously as Gestalt or sometimes as Körper, body, the ashraya is repeatedly visualized with the refrain, Svam, ashrayam pashyati. One sees one's own body or form projected in this yogic meditation. And this personal form, the ashraya, appears and disappears in many sequences so that the self is visualized, instantiated, and dissolved at will. And we're left here with the image of being empty, one own self abandoned. There is a recurring pattern of seeing an entity arise, followed by its disappearance or its dissolution, its layanam, as in the Buddhist theory of the dharmas. Some of these visualizations are explicitly framed as symbols. For example, in the Dhatu Prayoga section, we are told in a sequence of elemental visualizations that the image of the mouth or beak of an eagle arises, and this is followed by that of a firefly glowworm. That having dissolved, the image of the eagle, the yogin sees the sign of consciousness like a firefly glowworm, pulsating, blazing. On the whole, the meditating subject is referred to as a Yogācāra or a yogin, as I've mentioned. And by reading these passages in the Qizil Yoga Manual, we can see that even by the 4th to 6th century, there was a plethora of different practices in Buddhism, such as these visualizations, such as the practices of Yogachara understood in the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra, but they were all understood to fall under the umbrella term yoga. Just a few more points as I get towards the end. I also want to argue that taking a closer look at a text like the Qizil Manual, which is clearly a Central Asian text, but clearly derived from South Asian texts, allows us to learn something more about the early history of yoga meditation and how it traveled regionally by turning to look at Central Asia, to look at practices on the Silk Road. It also offers us the opportunity to deepen our understanding by thinking about some of these texts in relation to material religion or material culture. So I want to go back to one of the opening slides of this section, in which we might consider the material environment in which the Qizil Yoga Manual was located when it was found, the Kusha caves. In the case of the Qizil Yoga Manual and other manuals like it, the instructions in the text are only one part of the technique. The other part is the cave as an important environment of meditation and as a site decorated with images of meditation. So not only were adepts learning and reading from or reading manuals, but they were also meditating in caves for long periods. And furthermore, artists or monks were portraying images and figures related to meditation on cave walls. The cave was a key location for meditation practices in both South Asia and in Central Asia. Indeed, we can say that Kusha had its own distinct character of caves for meditation. In the rock temples there, more than 100 meditation caves are still recognizable. And the ubiquity of these special meditation cells, you can just see one here at the bottom of the image, cut into the rock. It led the material culture historians Howard and Vignato to conclude that meditation was a determining factor in the life of Kusha's monastic communities. In reference to another cave, not in Qizil, but in the Turfan area in Toyok, in reference to Toyok Cave 42 and other Buddhist visualization meditation treatises preserved in Chinese, Yamabi writes that considering that similar images also appear in the Yoga Lehrbuch, so on the walls of the cave appearing in the Yoga Lehrbuch, he thinks that these very peculiar images were commonly visualized by Central Asian meditators. The dimensions of the meditation cells were compact, with room for just one seated person, and they were bare and unadorned with images. So the images tended to be in the central chambers, and the side chambers for individual meditation were quite bare. So again, this is an illustration from Toyok, but the plans for the Qizil caves are fairly similar in some instances. So what was the significance of these cave images in relation to yogic visualization or meditative visualization? Scholars differ as to whether these murals were descriptive or intended as meditative objects, and how closely they were tied to the text. Certainly, some of the murals were not for meditation, but were about meditation. In such cases, paintings showed stylized scenes or tableau of meditation in practice, depicting figures whose heads are tilted to gaze at objects. Such paintings may have had a narrative or veneration function rather than practical. Howard asserts that because the primary site of meditation was the bare cell, the images in the main halls were not focal points or aids for meditation. So she sees them rather as records of the visions and the extraordinary powers of those who engaged in meditation. Yamabi, on the other hand, sees a very strong connection between the image, the text, and the practice. And he would argue that in some cases, the practitioner first looks upon the image on the wall and then withdraws to a side chamber to meditate upon it. So to sum up, the brief discussion here has demonstrated, I hope, that the materiality of the cave is a useful, if not necessary, context for interpreting the visual methods of yoga, Yogācāra, that are described in the Qizil Yoga manual. This context supports our understanding of how vivid visualization in a meditation cave could be designed as a practice and produced from a dynamic relationship or feedback loop with the adept's environment. So, for me, the big question here still remains, is it that the adept was using cave images to meditate, experiencing them internally, and then describing this process in manuals? Or is it that they're using the manuals to generate mental images that are then depicted onto the wall in a concrete form? Or is it just this very seamless feedback loop between all three? So to wrap up the talk, and to zoom back out to the idea of looking at Buddhist Śāstras or Buddhist technical texts on Yogācāra, my objective today has been to situate the Pātañjala Yoga Śāstra in its wider Buddhist intertextual field, reading Patanjali's text without the filter of Hindu only or Sankhya only or Brahmanic only can illuminate the subtle conceptual fabric of Patanjali's text as an ideologically synthetic composition, framed coherently within a Sankhya worldview, but also containing, and I would say restitching, many Buddhist ideas and practices. So I think I will leave it there so that we have some time for discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was very exciting. And as the material is so rich, it seems like there's so much work to be done here. And so thank you very much for giving us this overview and this introduction to this very exciting material. I was wondering, I mean, we don't have an awful lot of time, but we can continue in the evening session. Is there any definition of yoga that is very specific and it gives us some synonyms for that word?
There are not necessarily synonyms other than Yogācāra. I would say that in these texts, I think yoga and Yogācāra are fairly seamlessly interchanged. But in some of my other papers, I have brought forward some, quite concise definitions of yoga or Yogācāra in the Śravaka Bhumi or the Bodhisattva Bhumi. So I can reach for those and have those for this evening's discussion, if that's useful.
Yeah, I think that might be interesting because this is all about yoga, to know how that term is defined. Or you have been saying yoga is meditation here. And what exactly is that term for meditation that we get from the textual material?
It's often bhavana, meaning mental cultivation. Rather than, for example, dhyana, which would be much more specific. So there's this idea that it's cultivation, bhavana, and in some texts, it's cultivation of what's called the pratipaksha, so the counter state or the antidote.
Yeah.
So I've got some other work where I go into that particular definition in the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra, where yoga is the cultivation of the counter state to a klesha. So yoga is removing a klesha one by one systematically to attain this state of nirvana, so the complete cessation of the passions.
Yeah, so there are obviously different techniques subsumed under that word yoga. I would like to go to Philip. Yeah, Philip has raised his hand.
Yes, so first of all, congratulations to this very impressive and rich and clear systematic talk about the intellectual environment that needs to be connected to the Pātañjala Yoga Śāstra when we are studying the history of yoga in a comprehensive way. So it's absolutely crucial. And I think one aspect that might be added in order to explain the emergence or the ignorance of Buddhist scholarship in yoga studies is the fact that Buddhist studies has developed into its own field of research, which in a way has lost connection to Indology as a broader subject. So also academically, with regard to to individual chairs that were devoted exclusively to Buddhist studies by scholars that then only were studying Buddhist materials, and in other places people were only studying Hindu material. And I think it's urgently time to bring these fields together, as we could see from what you have presented us here. One question that I would like to ask is we are facing, I think, the emergence of yoga techniques also at the same time as the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra and other early systematic works of Śravakayana emerged also within early Hinduism, that is, for example, in the Mahabharata. And there we also have a similar phenomenon, namely that a single term may designate the practice and the practitioner. In the Mahabharata, yoga can be used as a term for somebody who practices yoga and for yoga itself. And I think that we also find comparable ideas there. Do you see any relationship between the Mahabharata and this early materials that you presented here?
That's a great question, and I haven't looked closely at the Mahabharata. I have done some comparative analysis, for example, looking at the kleshas. I was curious to understand if the Mahabharata had any of this language around bhavana or the kleshas, and it's fairly minimal, I would say. But there are many other aspects of many other topics in the Yogācārabhūmiśāstra that I haven't looked at comparatively in the Mahabharata. And I haven't really come up with a convincing rationale for why Yogācāra is sometimes practice and sometimes practitioner. I can't really find a particular rule or framework that makes the basis of that kind of explicable, really.
Yeah, so it may have to do with two different resolution of the compounds. Now, once as a Bahuvri and once as a Tatpurusha compound, maybe. No, so the practitioner would be the one whose achara is devoted to yoga, and the practice would be the execution, the devotion to yoga. So that's, but of course that doesn't explain why the same term is used for both. Yeah, thank you very much for your extraordinarily nice presentation here.
I just wanted to mention before we close the work of Professor Lambert-Schmidhausen, of course, on Yogācāra. I think who for a very long time has been studying these texts and also had expertise in Chinese, but I think a lot of it was published in German, so maybe it did not reach large audiences. But you're definitely right. I mean, there's so much work to be done, and I'm very glad you're taking this up. There is one question here that we can maybe quickly take from Sabi. Yes, can you unmute yourself?
It's quite a specific question. I was interested in these visualizations and the makara and different interpretations of that. So we see these, of course, in temple architecture in India. Do you see similar makaras? Could they be sea monsters? Do we see them portrayed in the cave images at all?
I can't comment for certain on whether they are portrayed in the caves. I think not, because I was in a workshop with Professor Yamabi, who has extensively documented those images, and he was still relating how it was a very curious term that he hadn't yet satisfactorily translated. But I think many scholars do translate it as a kind of water monster or some kind of great fish, but it does have these mythical contexts.
Yeah, it may be hard to imagine in this dry climate in Central Asia that they had ideas about makaras and fish. Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, I think it's clear that the caves are very much influenced by the Indian style and are modeled on, I think it's Howard and Vignato who say they're modeled on the caves at Ajanta and have exactly the same stylistic features. So whether or not there were artisans who were brought from South Asia to create these, we can't be certain, but that would certainly account for much of the similarities in art historical imagery, of which there are many. But I'm not sure about the makara. It's a good question.
Yeah, I think our time is up, unfortunately. I really enjoyed this, and I would like to thank you again for giving us this wonderful overview of the material. And we look forward to having more discussions tonight.
Thank you very much.